The wind has teeth tonight. It bites and tears at the thin fabric of her shawl, a merciless predator chasing its exhausted prey across the plains. Below, in the vast, dark bowl of the valley, a single light glimmers, a pinprick of hope in an ocean of despair. It is a lantern swinging from a post, illuminating the sturdy lines of a stable. For Alara, 9 months gone with child and running on nothing but the dregs of fear, is a beacon calling her to sanctuary. Each step is a negotiation with the screaming muscles in her back, the heavy, precious weight in her belly. The ground is uneven, and she stumbles, catching herself with a cry that the wind snatches from her lips. The scent of rain is on the air, promising a cold, drenching misery to compound her own. Finally, her hand touches the rough, weathered wood of the stable door. It's unlocked. She doesn't hesitate, slipping inside into the sudden, shocking warmth. The air is thick with the sweet, dusty smell of hay, the earthy aroma of horses, and the faint tang of leather. It is the smell of life, of shelter. In the dim light filtering from the swinging lantern outside, she can see the great, gentle shapes of horses shifting in their stalls, their soft snorts a kind of welcome. She doesn't dare venture further. Just inside the door, a deep pile of clean straw promises a bed softer than any she's known for weeks. With a sigh that is half sob, half relief, Alara sinks down into it, curling herself into the tightest ball her body will allow, trying to shelter the life within from the storm without. She is asleep before the first drop of rain begins to fall. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The man found her just after dawn. He moved with a quiet, practiced economy that spoke of years spent around skittish animals. He hadn't been surprised by the unlatched door. The wind did that sometimes. But the small, huddled shape in the straw near the entrance, that was new. He stopped, his hand resting on the handle of the pitchfork, his eyes narrowing in the gray light. He saw the swell of her belly first, the undeniable curve of late-term pregnancy. He saw the exhaustion etched onto her face, even in sleep, the dark circles under her eyes, the chapped lips. Her clothes were once of good quality, he noted, a fine wool now tattered and stained with travel. This was no common vagrant. He stood there for a long moment, a silent guardian in the quiet of the morning, the horses his only witnesses. He could call for the foreman, Croft. Croft would have her off the property in an instant, his voice like rocks grinding together, with no thought for her condition or the coming storm. The man looked from the sleeping woman to the dark, bruised sky. Another wave of rain was on its way. He thought of Croft's rigid cruelty, of the cold letter of the law he so enjoyed enforcing. And then he made a choice. He turned, walked to a tack locker, and pulled out a thick, coarse horse blanket. It smelled faintly of lanolin and animal warmth. Returning to her, he gently, carefully draped it over her sleeping form. Her brow furrowed for a second, and then she sighed, snuggling deeper into the unexpected warmth. He watched her for another moment, his expression unreadable, before picking up his pitchfork and starting his morning chores. The stable boy had just offered shelter to a ghost, and in doing so had bound his fate to hers, unaware that the true storm was not in the sky, but following in her wake. Alara awoke to the sound of soft nickering and the rhythmic scrape of a shovel against stone. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The scent of hay, the warmth of the heavy blanket, the profound sense of safety, it was all alien. Then memory returned in a painful rush. The flight, the fear, the desperate stumble into this refuge. She sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. A man was mucking out a stall at the far end of the long aisle. He was dressed in simple denim trousers and a homespun shirt, his back to her. He was lean but strong, his movement efficient. He was the stable boy. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her brief comfort. He would throw her out. He would call the foreman or the sheriff. Men in her recent experience were instruments of pain, dismissal, or threat. She scrambled to her feet, her body protesting, ready to flee again. The man must have heard the rustle of straw, for he stopped his work and turned. He wasn't young, but not old either. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, set deep beneath a serious brow. They regarded her without immediate anger, which was in itself a shock. There was just a quiet, steady watchfulness. "The rain's coming back on," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a simple statement of fact. Alara clutched the tattered edges of her shawl. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trespass. I'll go." He leaned the shovel against the stall door and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Go where?" "Into that." He nodded his head towards the door, where a fresh sheet of rain was now lashing against the wood. "You won't make it a mile." He paused, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her swollen abdomen before returning to her face. "There's a pump out back if you need water. Some tack that needs mending if you've a mind to earn a meal." The offer was so unexpected, so matter-of-fact, that it left her speechless. It wasn't charity, dripping with pity or condescension. It was a practical proposal, man to woman, survivor to survivor. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and unwelcome. She hadn't been treated with simple, practical dignity in months. She swallowed them down, forcing her voice to be steady. "I can mend tack. I'm a good seamstress." "All right, then," he said, and turned back to his work as if the matter was settled. His name, she learned, was Silas. He spoke little, but his actions were a language all their own. An hour later, he left a tin cup of water and a thick slice of bread and cheese on a clean cloth near where she sat, diligently stitching a broken bridle. He didn't say a word, just set it down and walked away to groom a handsome bay gelding. Alara ate with a hunger that shamed her, but the food was a confirmation of his offer, a tether to this fragile piece. She knew she was on the Calder Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory. She had heard the name spoken with a mixture of awe and envy in the last town she'd passed through. The owner was said to be a recluse, a man who had inherited the land but was rarely seen. The ranch was run by a foreman, a man named Croft, who had a reputation for being as hard as the land he managed. Hiding here, under the nose of such a man, felt both impossibly dangerous and, thanks to the quiet Stableboy, miraculously safe. Her own story was a bitter one. She was fleeing a man named Alistair Beaumont. He was a man of wealth and fine words, from a family that considered itself aristocracy in the rough-hewn West. He had courted her in secret, promising marriage, whispering of a life of ease. Alara, the daughter of a respectable but poor town doctor, had been swept away by him. When she had told him she was carrying his child, his promises had turned to ash. He'd offered her money to take care of the problem. When she refused, horrified, his charm had curdled into a chilling threat. He spoke of his family's reputation, of the scandal. He made it clear that she and the child were an inconvenience that could be permanently removed. So she had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few dollars she'd managed to save. Beaumont's reach was long, his pride vast. She knew he would not simply let her disappear. He would hunt her, not out of love or responsibility, but to erase his mistake. Silas, meanwhile, was conducting an experiment. He was Silas Calder, the reclusive owner, and he had been working among his own men for a month. He'd grown weary of reports and ledgers that told him nothing of the heart of his ranch. He'd heard whispers of his foreman's heavy hand, of discontent among the ranch hands. So he had arrived unannounced, a stranger looking for work, and Croft, ever in need of cheap labor, had hired him on the spot as a stable hand. It was a position that gave him the perfect vantage point. From the stable, he saw everything: the exhausted horses, the ill-fitting saddles that caused sores, the way Croft shorted the men on their grain rations to sell the surplus on the side. He saw the fear and resentment Croft fostered. The foreman was a meticulous tyrant, running the ranch with brutal efficiency but bleeding it of all loyalty and spirit. Silas was gathering his facts, waiting for the right moment to clean his own house. And then Alara had stumbled into his path, a complication he hadn't foreseen. She was everything Croft would despise. A stray, a burden, a woman of obvious breeding now fallen low. Protecting her was an act of rebellion against the very man he was there to observe. It was impulsive. It was dangerous. And as he watched her carefully stitching the leather, her brow furrowed in concentration, her presence a pocket of quiet industry in his dusty sanctuary, he felt no regret. He only felt the weight of his decision settle more firmly onto his shoulders. The world outside the stable was a place of harsh judgments and cruel men. In here, for now, they were just two people sharing the quiet dark, each hiding from a world that had failed them. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. The next morning, the stable door was thrown open with a crash that made the horses shy and dance in their stalls. A bull of a man stood silhouetted against the bright morning light. He had a thick neck, a florid face, and a perpetual scowl that seemed carved into his features. This was Croft. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, swept the stable and landed on Alara, who was sweeping straw near the entrance. She froze, the broom held tight in her hands, her face paling. "What in the blazes is this?" Croft's voice was a gravelly roar. "I run a ranch, not a charity house for every stray cat and beggar that wanders by." He took a menacing step towards her. "Get out, now, before I have you thrown out." Alara shrank back, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. Before Croft could take another step, Silas moved, placing himself between the foreman and the terrified woman. He didn't touch Croft, but his presence was a solid, unmoving wall. "She's with me," Silas said, his voice level calm. Croft's scowl deepened. He looked Silas up and down with contempt. "With you? A stable hand? Don't be a fool, Calder. I know you're kind. You think with what's in your trousers and get soft over a pretty face. She's a vagrant, likely a thief." "She's my cousin," Silas lied, the word tasting strange on his tongue. He had never been a good liar, but desperation was a sharp tutor. "Her husband died. She's got nowhere to go. I told her she could stay. She'll earn her keep here in the stable." The lie was audacious, a direct challenge to Croft's authority. The foreman's face turned a shade darker, a mottled purple. He was clearly furious at this insubordination from a lowly hand. He looked from Silas's implacable face to Alara's frightened one. He could fire Silas on the spot, throw them both out. But good help was hard to keep under his command, and Silas, for all his quietness, was a good worker. The owner, the mysterious Mr. Calder, was also rumored to have a soft spot for family, or so the stories went. Firing a man for helping his own widowed, pregnant kin might look bad if it ever got back to the man in charge. Croft let out a snort of disgust. "Fine," he spat, the word clipped and sharp. "But she's your responsibility. Any trouble, any theft, and it comes out your hide. And your pay. She eats, you pay for it." "Understood, understood," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. Croft gave Alara one last withering look, then turned on his heel and stomped out, slamming the door behind him. The silence he left in his wake was profound. The immediate threat was gone, but a new reality had been forged. Alara stared at Silas, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning gratitude. He had stood up for her. This stranger, this quiet man of the stables, had lied for her, had put his own livelihood on the line for her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas picked up the shovel he'd dropped, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the stable walls. "No one should have to face a storm alone," he said, as if that explained everything. He didn't look at her, but the act was more intimate than any touch. He had claimed her, not as property, but as a responsibility, as kin. In that moment, their silent, fragile truce became a pact, sealed by a lie and witnessed only by the horses. She was no longer just a refugee. She was the Stableboy's cousin. And he was no longer just a benefactor. He was her sworn protector. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm established itself in the sanctuary of the stable. Alara, true to her word, proved to be an invaluable help. She had a gentle hand with the horses, calming the more nervous ones with a soft word and a steady touch. She polished the brass on the harnesses until it shone, mended blankets with tiny, perfect stitches, and kept the tack room more organized than Silas had ever seen it. Her presence transformed the dusty, masculine space. It began to feel less like a workplace and more like a home. A small pot of wildflowers appeared on a windowsill. The scent of drying herbs she gathered from just outside the door mingled with the smell of hay and leather. They rarely spoke of their pasts. Their communication was a tapestry woven from shared tasks and small, unspoken gestures. When Silas came in from the rain, soaked to the bone, he would find a dry shirt laid out for him. When he saw her pressing a hand to the small of her back, wincing in pain, he would quietly move a heavy bucket out of her way or insist she sit and rest while he finished a task. He began leaving a larger portion of his own meal for her, waving off her protests with a gruff, "The baby needs it." Despite the silence, they were learning each other. Silas observed the innate grace in her movements, the way she held herself, which even her ragged clothes and advanced pregnancy couldn't hide. He saw the flicker of intelligence in her eyes when she watched him calculate feed rations. One afternoon, he found her tracing the words on a sack of oats, her lips moving silently. "You can read," he stated, his voice soft. She looked up, startled, a faint blush on her cheeks. "My father was a doctor." He believed a woman's mind was as important as her husband's prospects. A shadow passed over her face. A foolish belief, it turned out. He didn't press. But the piece of information settled into his understanding of her. She was educated, gently bred. Her fall had been a long and painful one. He found himself growing angrier at the unknown man who had put her in this position. She, in turn, was learning him. She saw the way his calloused hands could be surprisingly gentle when treating a horse's split hoof. She noticed the keenness of his gaze as he watched the land, the sky, the way he could predict the weather with an accuracy that startled her. He was more than a simple laborer. There was a depth to his quietness, a thoughtfulness that she saw when he believed no one was watching. He seemed to carry a weight on his shoulders that had nothing to do with sacks of grain. Sometimes she would catch him staring out towards the main ranch house, a grand but distant structure on a low hill, his expression complex and troubled. She assumed he was dreaming of a better life, a life beyond the stables, and her heart ached for him. The fragile peace of their world was first disturbed by a visit from one of the ranch hands, a garrulous man named Pete. He'd come to fetch a new rope and lingered to gossip. "Heard tell there's a big reward being offered over in Dusty Creek," Pete said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the door. "Some fancy city fellow, name of Beaumont, is looking for a woman who run off on him. Says she stole from him. From a description, sounds like she's in the family way." Alara, who had been brushing down a mare, went utterly still. The brush paused on the horse's flank. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the handle. Silas saw the blood drain from her face, saw the stark terror that flashed in her eyes before she could hide it. He stepped forward, drawing Pete's attention. "That's so?" Silas asked, his tone deliberately casual. "Folks will say anything for a reward. Probably just some poor girl who got tired of his nonsense." "Maybe so," Pete shrugged, coiling the rope over his shoulder. "But $100 is $100. A man could do a lot with that. He's got posters up and everything." He tipped his hat. "Evenin', Alara." The use of her name, so casually, felt like a betrayal. She knew it wasn't Pete's fault. He didn't know. But the world was shrinking. The name Beaumont, spoken aloud in her sanctuary, was like a physical blow. After Pete left, a heavy silence descended. Alara resumed her brushing, but her movements were stiff, automatic. That evening, Silas worked late, reshoeing a lame horse. Alara sat nearby, mending a shirt of his by the light of a single lantern. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he straightened up, his back aching. He looked at her, her head bent over her work, the lantern light catching the gold in her hair. "You're safe here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She didn't look up. "He'll find me. Men like him always do." "Then we'll face him when he comes," Silas replied. Her hands stilled. She finally raised her head, and her eyes, luminous in the lantern light, were filled with a desperate, questioning hope. "Why are you doing this, Silas? You don't know me. Croft could fire you. This man, Beaumont, he's dangerous." Silas walked over to the workbench and picked up a small block of pine he'd been whittling in his spare moments. He held out to her. In his palm was a small, crudely carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. It was simple, but it was rendered with a surprising tenderness. "I know you're a good woman in a bad spot," he said, his voice losing some of its roughness. "And I know no one deserves to be hunted. This is for the little 1 inch." Tears she could no longer suppress welled up and spilled down her cheeks. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the small wooden bird, her fingers brushing his. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth in the cold fear that had surrounded her for months. It was the first gift, the first sign of kindness she had received for her unborn child. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. Their moment of connection was shattered the very next day. Croft stormed into the stable, his face a thundercloud. "Calder," he bellowed. "I've just had word. The owner is coming. He'll be here by the end of the week for a full inspection." Silas felt a jolt, not of fear, but of grim finality. His time as an observer was over. Croft's eyes landed on Alara with renewed venom. "I want this place spotless. And I want her—" He jerked his chin at Alara, gone. "The owner doesn't abide by strays and charity cases. It looks bad. It looks weak. I want her off my ranch by sundown tomorrow. Am I clear?" The ultimatum hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "My ranch," Croft had said. The possessiveness in the foreman's tone solidified a cold resolve in Silas's gut. The time for observation was over. The time for action had arrived. He looked at Alara, who was staring at Croft with a renewed, hunted terror. The sanctuary he had built for her was about to be torn down, and she believed he was powerless to stop it. The weight of Croft's ultimatum pressed down on the stable, suffocating the fragile peace they had built. Alara was a ghost of herself, moving through her chores with a leaden, heartbreaking despair. She saw the end. She would be cast out, back into the wilderness, with Beaumont's shadow looming ever closer and the birth of her child imminent. She believed Silas was as trapped as she was, a kind man subject to the whims of a cruel foreman. The only honorable thing to do, she decided, was to remove the burden of her presence from his shoulders. He had already risked too much. That evening, after a tense, silent meal, Silas went to check on a sick foal. When he returned to the main stable, he saw her by the faint light of the moon slanting through the high window. She had her few, pitiful belongings wrapped in the coarse blanket he had first given her. Her face was set in a mask of grim resolution. She was preparing to run again. His heart clenched. He had offered her a refuge, and the world had still found a way to tear it down. He moved silently, his boots making no sound on the straw-strewn floor, and stopped just behind her. "Don't," he said. The word was not a command, but a plea. She jumped, whirling around, her hand flying her chest. "Silas, you startled me. I told you I would face him when he comes," he said, his voice low and intense. "I meant any man who threatens you, Croft included." "You can't," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He'll dismiss you. You'll have nothing. I can't let you lose your livelihood because of me. I am not your responsibility." "I made you my responsibility," he countered, taking a step closer. The air between them crackled. "When I told Croft you were my cousin. When I promised you were safe here. I don't break my word, Alara." "But the owner," she choked on the word. "Croft said he won't allow it. You'll be thrown out with me." This was the moment. He could tell her everything. He could reveal his identity and watch the shock and confusion transform her face. But it felt wrong, like a trick. He needed her to trust him, not the title of owner. He needed her to have faith in the man she had come to know, the stable boy, not the powerful figure she had never met. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently took the bundle from her grasp and set on the ground. His hands, calloused and rough, then came up to cup her shoulders. The touch was firm, grounding. "Listen to me," he said, forcing her to meet his gaze. Forget what Croft says. Forget the owner. You look at me. Have I given you any reason to doubt me? She searched his face, the steady gray eyes, the hard line of his jaw that was set not in anger, but in fierce determination. He had fed her, sheltered her, protected her, and asked for nothing in return. He had defended her against a man who terrified everyone else. He had carved a gift for her child. In a world that had shown her only betrayal, he had been a bedrock of simple, quiet integrity. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. No, she breathed. Then I'm asking you to trust me now. Don't run. Stay. Let me handle Croft. Let me handle the owner. I promise you, Alara, you are safe on this ranch. This is your home now, if you'll have it. The words, your home, struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had offered her a home. They had offered her transactions, threats, or dismissals. He was offering her belonging. It was a risk, a terrifying leap of faith into the arms of a man she barely knew, a man who was, by all accounts, as powerless as she was. But looking into his eyes, she saw a strength that had nothing to do with station or wealth. It was the strength of conviction. Slowly, she nodded. I'll stay, she whispered. Relief, so profound it was almost visible, washed over his features. He gave her shoulders a gentle squeeze before letting go, the moment of contact leaving a phantom warmth on her skin. He had his answer. She had chosen to trust him. Now, he had to prove worthy of that trust. The final piece of the storm broke the next afternoon. A rider galloped into the ranch yard, his horse lathered, and made straight for the main house where Croft was overseeing a frantic cleaning effort. Minutes later, the foreman himself came marching towards the stable, his face alight with a kind of malicious glee. He was followed by a man who oozed an arrogant entitlement. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, dressed in expensive riding clothes that were barely dusty. Alara saw him, and her blood ran cold. It was Alistair Beaumont. I was told I'd find my property here, Beaumont said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an underlying edge of steel. His eyes locked on Alara, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. There you are, my dear. Did you really think you could hide from me in a place like this? Amongst the filth, Alara felt nailed to the spot, her breath trapped in her lungs. The nightmares had become real. Croft puffed out his chest, eager to please the wealthy visitor. We were just about to remove her, Mr. Beaumont. A vagrant, caused nothing but trouble. Beaumont ignored him, his focus entirely on Alara. He took a step forward, his smile turning into a sneer. You will come with me now. We have matters to discuss. You've caused me a great deal of embarrassment. He reached for her arm. Leave her be. The voice was quiet, yet it cut through the air and stopped Beaumont's hand in midair. Silas stepped out from the shadows of a stall, positioning himself once more between Alara and the threat. He wasn't holding a pitchfork this time. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. Beaumont and Croft both turned to look at him. Croft laughed a short, ugly bark. You again? Get out of the way, you fool. This is gentry business. I said, Silas repeated, his voice dropping lower, gaining a dangerous resonance. To leave her be. Beaumont looked Silas up and down with disdain, from his worn-out boots to his simple shirt. And who are you to tell me what to do? A stable hand? A hired boy who smells of manure. He gestured to two rough-looking men who had ridden in with him and were waiting by the door. Remove him. Try not to break him too badly. The two men started forward, their intentions clear. Alara cried out, a strangled sound of fear. Silas didn't even glance at the advancing thugs. His eyes were locked on Croft. His voice was no longer quiet. It was clear, cold, and carried an authority that seemed to come from the very land itself, stunning everyone into silence. Croft, the foreman, surprised at being addressed so directly, blinked. What? You're fired, Silas said simply. Collect your personal items from the house and be off my land by sunset. The statement was so absurd, so utterly out of place, that for a moment, no one reacted. The two thugs stopped in their tracks. Croft stared, his mouth agape, as if Silas had started speaking in tongues. Then he let out a sputtering, incredulous laugh. You're firing me? You witless stable boy. You've finally lost what little mind you had. Beaumont smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. It seems the country air has addled his brain. Get him out of here. I don't think you understand, Silas said, his gaze still fixed on the sputtering foreman. My name is Silas Calder. This is the Calder Ranch. He let the words sink in, watching the dawning horror replace the fury on Croft's face. He then turned his cool, gray eyes on Beaumont, whose smirk had frozen and begun to crumble. And this woman, Silas moved almost imperceptibly, so he was standing slightly in front of Alara, a human shield, is under my protection. Now, you and your men will leave my property immediately. If you ever come near her or this ranch again, I will use the full extent of my influence and the law to see you ruined. Am I understood? The revelation struck the stable yard like a bolt of lightning. The stable boy was the owner. The quiet, watchful man who mucked stalls and mended tack was the reclusive, powerful Silas Calder. Alara stared at his back, at the solid set of his shoulders, and everything clicked into place. His quiet authority, his knowledge of the land, his troubled gazes toward the main house, his promise that she would be safe from the owner. He hadn't been lying. He had been telling her the deepest truth of all. Croft's florid face went a pasty, sickly white. His entire world had just been upended by the man he had bullied and belittled for a month. Beaumont, for his part, was a man whose power was built entirely on the perception of his superiority. Faced with a man who so clearly and calmly eclipsed him in actual power, whose land he stood on, he deflated. His threats, his arrogance, his two hired thugs, they were all meaningless here. He sputtered, tried to regain some semblance of dignity. This is an outrage. She's a thief, a liar. She's a guest in my home. Silas cut him off, his voice flat and final. And you are a trespasser. Leave. Now. There was no arguing, with the absolute conviction in his tone. Defeated, humiliated, Beaumont cast one last look of pure hatred at Alara and the man who protected her. Then, without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his men scrambling to follow. He did not look back. The dust settled in the stable yard. A stunned silence fell over the remaining ranch hands who had gathered to watch the commotion. Croft stood frozen for a beat longer, then seemed to shrink into himself, all his bluster gone. He turned and shuffled away towards the main house, a broken man. The threat that had haunted Alara for months, a force she believed to be insurmountable, had been dismantled in less than a minute by a few quiet words. Silas stood for a moment, watching the road until Beaumont was a distant speck. Then he turned, his shoulders seeming to lose some of their tension. He looked at Alara. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, relief, confusion, and a dawning, overwhelming gratitude that left her breathless. The deception of his identity didn't matter. It was dwarfed by the magnitude of his protection. He hadn't saved her with the power of his name. He had saved her with the strength of his character, and only revealed the name when it was the final tool required. Are you all right? He asked, his voice returning to its familiar quietness. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He looked around the stable, at the familiar stalls, the scent of hay, the place that had been their shared world. Then his gaze lifted to the ranch house on the hill, which now looked less like a distant dream and more like a simple fact. Come, he said gently, let's get you out of the dam. He began to walk, not waiting for her to follow, but simply assuming she would. And she did. She walked beside him, leaving the stable behind, moving across the yard and up the gentle slope towards the main house. It was a place she had only ever seen from afar, a symbol of the power and wealth of a man she thought she'd never meet. Now, she was approaching it as his guest. He reached the wide porch and opened the heavy oak door. He stood aside, holding it for her. She paused on the threshold, hesitating. This was a new world. The stable had been a refuge, but it was a refuge born of desperation. This house was something else entirely. It was a promise. She looked at him, at his weathered face, his steady gray eyes. He was no longer Silas the stable boy, Nor was he fully Silas Calder, the great ranch owner. He was just Silas, the man who had covered her with a blanket, who had lied for her, who had carved a bird for her child, who had faced down her demons. He saw the hesitation in her eyes and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the same silent language they had always spoken, a look that said everything words could not. It said, "You're welcome. You are safe. You belong. Welcome home, Elara," he said softly. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin and stepped across the threshold, leaving the cold wind, the fear, and the ghost of Alistair Beaumont behind her. She stepped out of the shadows and into the warmth of the home he offered, into the quiet, sturdy sanctuary of his protection. His hand hovered near the small of her back, not touching, but there, a silent, steadfast promise in the vast, quiet landscape of their new beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.